Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And like I said, I really do appreciate you being with me. Pardon me. We are involved in what is, without any doubt, one of the most fascinating and very significant, I should also point out, studies that imaginable, and that is Israel's feast days. I've shared with you in my early upbringing, in my background, any discussion of the importance or the significance, any suggestion that the feast days of Israel were highly significant would have elicited a, why are you saying that? Now, mind you, there was an acknowledgement of the importance of Passover and certainly Pentecost. But beyond that, any suggestion that the last three of Israel's feast days, which are the eschatological feast days, would have been met with basically almost open derision. You're crazy, Preston, because everyone knows that God nailed the old covenant to the cross. Everyone knows that God was through with Israel at the cross. And so that means, by the way, for those of you who are in my audience, who perhaps come from that background, who are still in that background, I'm very familiar with how the very idea of a study of the feast days and how it might relate to eschatology is somewhat of a head scratcher. And it may even be, whoa, no, that can't be true, because once again, God was through with Israel and the law at the cross. Now, I understand that philosophy very well. I taught it for years until I learned better. But once we grasp the reality, point number one, that the law did not pass away at the cross. And point number two, that when Paul wrote Colossians, when he wrote Ephesians, the law involving the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths remained in effect. And I'll be going into Colossians chapter 2 more in depth. But for today, all right, and to finish that point, what we have to see is that when Paul wrote, those new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths were still, it's in the present tense, folks, shadows of good things that were, when Paul wrote, about to come. Now, if the law with Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur and Feast of Harvest, if it was still a shadow of good things to come, then it wasn't fulfilled. If it wasn't fulfilled, it had not passed away. Period. End of story. Now, by the way, let me take a real quick digression here. I need to apologize because on the Friday night, Saturday, Preterist Apologetics, I misquoted James chapter 2, 10 and following. I quoted that if you keep the whole royal law and yet offend in one point. That's not an accurate quote. Somebody pointed it out to me. Some were not so kind in pointing it out. Some said you just blew it, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's what happens sometimes. You know, if you're perfect enough to never, ever misquote a verse, then more power to you. And I'm not trying to be snide at all. It's just the way we are. But in James chapter 2, 10 and following, James said, if you keep the royal law, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, then you do well. Okay? Well, that royal law is thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But then he goes ahead to say that if you break one law of Torah, no, I'm not quoting, then you're guilty of the entire law. And what law is he talking about? Decalogue. So he says to break one law of Torah was to become guilty of the entire law. Paul expresses it like this, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 10. Those who are under the law are under a curse. Why? Because the law says, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. What does that mean? You violate one law, you're cursed. Okay? Now, that raises all questions about forgiveness and grace and what have you under the law, and that's not the purpose of this video, all right? I'm simply pointing out, point number one, I misquoted James 2:10, and I apologize for that. It was just a slip. Mental burp, if you please. And secondly, the point that I made is still valid. You violate one law. Thou shalt not kill, you're guilty of the whole law. Thou shalt not steal, you're guilty of the whole law. When you're guilty of the whole law, you're under a curse. That's the point I was making. I just simply misquoted James 2:10. So once again, I apologize for that. Okay, what I want to touch on today is the exciting reality. And this is where the subject of the feast days impinges on eschatology. But before I do that, I want to drive home a point that is extremely, extremely critical. My Sabbatarian friends, with whom I've been interacting for years and years and years, try to draw a distinction between the law of Moses and the law of God. I've heard this distinction more times than I can count. And somehow, some way, it is argued, well, the law of Moses, with its, quote, ceremonial laws, was supposed to pass away. In fact, the argument is made. In Colossians chapter 2, where Paul says, don't let any man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, Paul was talking about the ceremonial law. And he says, that was the law of commandments, contained in ordinances that was nailed to the cross. It was contrary to us, Paul says. And it was nailed to the cross. So once again, the argument is all of the ceremonial aspects of the law, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the non-seventh day Sabbaths were nailed to the cross. But then you have the law of God. And that is supposedly the Ten Commandments. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a completely false dichotomy. Now, is it true that the Decalogue is called the law of God? Yes, it is. Never denied that. Is it also true, let's just focus here on the feast days, is it true that every single one of the feast days, from Sabbath to Shemini Atzeret in Leviticus chapter 23, is it true that they are all called the feasts of the Lord? Yes, undeniably, unequivocally, every single feast day was a feast of the Lord. They're never called, to my knowledge, the feasts of Moses. Now, even if they were, it wouldn't mean anything because where would Moses get them? And the same fact, the same question applies to all of the mandates of Torah. Moses didn't go up on the mountain and God tell him, okay, now here's my law, go back down and I'm going to give you your law. Absolutely a false dichotomy. The Ten Commandments, as we call them, are 10 words. They are the foundation of all of the other mandates of Torah. I mean, they're all that way. Whether that goes into thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife or his property or whatever, and how that would work out in the everyday life. So here are the foundational commandments to be sure. And the outworking of those 10 words is to be found in the rest of the law, the expansion of the law that was given by God through Moses. Matter of fact, Galatians chapter 3 says the law. The law was mediated by angels through Moses. That's at Sinai. Furthermore, we need to understand, and once again, this is so critical, in the delineation of all of the feast days, not only are they called the feasts of the Lord, as the Lord describes each one of the feast days, from Passover all the way again through Shemini Atzeret, every single one of the feast days either began or concluded with a Sabbath. Now, we know that the Sabbath was a feast day. Leviticus 23, verse 2. It was a feast day of the Lord. There is not one word of delineation in Leviticus chapter 23 between the Sabbath as a feast of the Lord and Passover as a feast of the Lord, which also entailed a Sabbath. So, the point I'm making is that every single one of Israel's, and yes, they are Israel's feast days, but where did they come from? The Lord. Every single one of Israel's feast days was in fact a feast day of the Lord. And then, the point that I was about to make, every single one of those feast days either began or ended with a Sabbath. No delineation whatsoever in the text that says, that hinted, that implied, that in any way whatsoever, okay, now guys, the seventh day feast day is more important than all these other feast days. They are all, to reiterate, feasts of the Lord. Now, just recently on YouTube, in order to try to escape the power of that, one gentleman, and he is a gentleman, he's been very kind and very respectful in his responses, and I appreciate that. He says, well, everything belongs to the Lord. That's not the point. That's obfuscation. That's evading the point. God was setting forth all of the feast days, and they are all his feast days. So try to say, for instance, oh, well, you got the feast of the Lord, then you got the feast of Israel. No, that's an improper delineation, an improper distinction. All of them, hope this doesn't sound repetitious, it's critical. All of them are feast days. Now here's something that's fascinating and something that's very critical as well. We are told concerning the fourth commandment, the seventh day Sabbath, that anyone doing work on that day was to be slain. Well, here once again the delineation comes in on the part of the Sabbatarian folks, and they say, well, the death penalty has been done away with, but we're still commanded to keep the Sabbath. Point number one, Christians are not commanded to keep the Sabbath. I'm still waiting for someone to show me that. Just like on YouTube, I've been pressing, I've been asking, I've been challenging for someone to show me where any pagan nation, any nation other than Israel, was ever commanded to keep the Sabbath. So far, I have number one, an admission, no, Sabbath was not given to anyone other than Israel. Okay, then Sabbath doesn't belong to anyone but Israel, or did not belong to anyone but Israel. Old covenant Israel under Torah. Today, the church is not old covenant Israel under under Torah. That's a critical point. Secondly, to return to what I mentioned just a moment ago, in Leviticus chapter 23, and giving the law concerning Yom Kippur, the Lord said, anyone not observing that day in the proper spirit, anyone unprepared, anyone observing the Day of Atonement improperly, was to be put to death. Now, what would that mean? And incidentally, the Jews called the Day of Atonement the most important feast. Well, why would they say that? Because that's when Israel's sins were dealt with. But what this tells us, at the very least, is that Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and Sabbath were on equal footing in this regard. You violate Sabbath, you die. You violate Yom Kippur, you die. No distinction in importance whatsoever. Somebody might say, well, yeah, but Yom Kippur is not in the Decalogue. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Nowhere is there that false distinction made. These are the words that are most important versus these. You sin, you violate Sabbath, you die. You violate Yom Kippur, you die. Equal importance. And then finally for today, what is to be observed very carefully. After giving each one of the feast days and expressing that either beginning or ending of each one of those feast days was a Sabbath unto the Lord, the Lord says in Leviticus chapter 23, these what? These feast days. These feast days of the Lord. These Sabbaths of these feast days of the Lord are the Sabbaths of the Lord. Now, he uses, in the Septuagint, of course, the plural, Sabbaton. These are the feasts, plural, or these feasts, plural, are the Sabbaths, plural, of the Lord. There is therefore absolutely zero justification for saying, well, you have the Sabbaths of Israel or the Sabbaths of the law of Moses versus the Sabbath of the Lord. No. That is a false distinction. So, when we're talking about the Sabbaths, ladies and gentlemen, they are all feasts of the Lord, and they are all Sabbaths of the Lord, and it is totally inappropriate, totally unjustified to seek to make a distinction between a Sabbath of the Lord regarding the 6 other feast days versus the Sabbath of the Lord, the 7th day. Because remember, the Decalogue, the 10 words, are the foundation. I would even say they are the spring from which all of the other commandments, including the rest of the feast days, flowed, not because Moses gave them and somehow depreciated the value of it, but because Yahweh delivered them to Israel, to Moses, through Moses. There is not one single text in all of Scripture that disparages in any way whatsoever the, quote, law of Moses versus the law of God. That is a point that is absolutely critical. Now, tomorrow, we're going to define, quote, the law. Because once again, the distinction is often made by my Sabbatarian friends. Well, you have the law of Moses. The law of Moses passed away. The law of God could never pass away. I'll see you on the flip side.